Hey guys, this is Milo back with another video, and today I'm going to be restoring a vintage hatchet. This is a genuine Plum Boy Scouts hatchet. It's very small. It has one of those little nail pullers, and I did some research online, and they're from about the 30s or 40s. And right now I'm just going to sharpen the hatchet, so I'm sharpening it with a Mill Bastard file. This is a 6-inch, but I recently bought a bunch of 12-inch files. And honestly, I'd say my favorite is like 12-inch for reprofiling, and then for sharpening the 8-inch, just because the teeth are smaller, and it seems to cut around the transitions a bit easier, especially if you're filing convex. One thing that I always do with these older axes is I joint the cutting edge. Usually there's some chips that go pretty far in, and you need to even out the surface and compensate for some of the transitions with the toe. For example, the toe gets worn back, so you kind of want to remove material in front of that so it's not as Jurassic. And it's just good to have a semicircle cutting edge that's pretty uniform throughout the entire surface. And this is at 22.5 degrees, and I'm happy with that because this is for splitting, so it doesn't have to be too thin. And I never leave the edge fully filed. I always grind and then strop afterwards, just so it can get as sharp as possible. And it also helps with the durability of the edge because it removes all of the channels that the file creates. And for most files, you can't actually look at it and see the channels. You usually want it to be more of an even surface just for durability and aesthetics too. And right now I'm just going to clean the rust off. I'm using WD-40 and a wire brush. I usually use steel wool, and that seems to be a bit more effective, but this is going to work fine for now, especially since I'm out of steel wool. And now it's the wonderful time for hanging the head. I'm going to mark with a pencil how much material I have to remove. I use that as a general guide because of the width of the pencil kind of makes it not exactly perfect. But I also take off a lot of material at the top of the tongue so that I can fit more of the wedge in. I actually hung an axe today and I didn't take that much material off the top. It's not required to do that, but I think a fatter wedge looks better aesthetically. Another thing that you can do is just make the kerf wider because essentially that's just removing material so that you can fit more wedge in. There's no reason for a wide kerf other than to create that clearance. And right now I'm just hammering on the butt of the axe, and I'm going to drift it back out. I usually do this without knowing that it's tight enough, because then it helps me just look down the handle and line everything up, make sure it's going on correctly, and then also I can see where the head is tearing into the grain, and that's where I remove the material. So it's just kind of the system that I do it, and it seems to work pretty well. People always say that you want to have the smallest ninja shelf possible, and I usually get like a tiny one creating, but I usually just use the chisel to get rid of that, and I've never seen that as an issue, and my heads do not come loose after hanging them. So of course I'm doing it right. And it doesn't seem possible to make a fat enough chamfer to create no ninja shelf with a file, but maybe if you use a Dremel tool then you can have complete compression with no shelf at all. And I repeated the process of drifting the eye, removing material, hammering the axe back on or hanging it, and then doing that over and over until the head is low enough to where I'm comfortable with it. Then I make sure the kerf is 2/3 the way down the handle. And now I'm marking off the wedge, how far it needs to go, and also how wide it should be. This wedge actually doesn't fill up enough of the eye. I usually use wedges that are too fat and I don't get all the way down to the 2/3, and that's fine as long as it's tight and it goes far enough in. It really depends on feel and just what you think is best, but I could have used a bit more of a thicker wedge for this one. I've also started using wood glue on all of my wedges. It seems like it's only not necessary when you're using a softwood wedge. With hardwood wedges, I've noticed that the wedges kind of get pushed out over time if I only use linseed oil. And as you can see, I seat the wedge down as far as it needs to go. It can't really go down any farther than it has already. And okay, that was kind of funny. I did cut myself working on this axe. This video is like a month old, but after I cut myself, I made sure to cover the cutting edge, and that's something that I'd always recommend doing when you work on axes. I'm sawing off the top of the wedge, and I'm leaving it proud like I always do, just so I can get that mushrooming over, which really helps the head stay on tight. And I also don't really trust a flush cut wedge. I know there's probably not too much of a difference. There's a lot of people that do that, and it works perfectly fine. It's really just personal preference. And because I didn't fill enough of the eye, I'm using a metal wedge where it needs to compress a bit more. And the metal wedge goes down in perfectly fine, and it fills up that space, so I'm very happy with how it turned out. It did crack the wood a tiny bit, and I'm glad it didn't crack it anymore just because it's not aesthetically pleasing, but functionally that cracking is like perfect because it just shows that it's as tight as it can be, and the only thing left is for the wood to crack. There's no more space that needs to be filled. And now I'm thinning the handle. I removed wood on the top and the sides. I'm kind of creating a rectangle. I keep the sides of the handle flat. I feel like that fits my hand a lot better. And I've noticed that it helps keep the axe aligned while you're swinging it with the bit in the front. Another great shape for handles is octagonal. It really fits the hand well. If you look at your hand and you make a circle, you'll see that it's not a perfect circle. It looks more like an octagon, and that's basically the general idea behind it. And it helps you keep the axe aligned too. I haven't made a handle like that before, but it would be very interesting to see how that would feel. But the shape that would suck the most is a circle, and that's just because it would be hard to keep the head aligned. You would never know where the center of the axe should be, so I can't even imagine chopping with a circular handle. I think that would be a nightmare. And right now I am blending the transitions with my Shinto rasp. I tried using my American rasp for this work today, and it leaves a really coarse finish. I have to say the Japanese rasps really are the best for this kind of work. And I'm using sandpaper now to just sand it all out, finish it up. I start with a medium grit, I think it's around 120, and then I move to a finer grit to finish it. And I always just try and get out all of those rasp marks so it can be as smooth as possible. And what's really interesting is you can see there's a little heart in this handle. I show off the axe once it's done later on, and you can see that heart better, but I think that's really cool. I'm using Watco Danish oil to oil the handle, and I've noticed no real big difference with this and linseed oil. I prefer linseed just because it smells better, but you can choose which either you want. They both put heavy metals inside of it, so it's not like one's better, unless if you choose raw linseed oil, but then that's going to take forever to dry, so there is a big trade-off with that. And I use coconut oil on the head, and that's totally fine. It's organic, you put it in food and all sorts of stuff, and that just helps the head not rust, and I have a lot of it, so I might as well use it. And this is what the axe looks like. The wedge turned out really well. That's what the heart looks like in the handle. I really think that's so cool. The grain orientation on this handle is perfect. It has a pretty wide grain, and it's straight, and it's aligned with the handle. Apparently wide grain is better because it's more flexible. And that's the end of today's video. If you liked it, please feel free to like and subscribe, and peace out, guys.